Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the Editorial Director at Choice. If you're new to The Authority File, you can listen to and find previous episodes on all of the major podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and on our website, choice360.org. My guests for this series are Tamsine O'Riordan, Editorial Director, Social Science, and Felicity Plester, Editorial Director, Humanities, both from Palgrave Macmillan. In the next 4 episodes of this series, which is provided with support from Palgrave Macmillan, Tamsine and Felicity provide a fascinating look behind the scenes at how humanities and social sciences publishing supports social justice. We'll look at the roles HSS plays in the way we solve and confront some of the most pressing issues of the day from the perspectives of research acquisition, community engagement, and the publisher's own internal operations. In this second episode, we turn our gaze inward and look at the DEI policies and practices of Palgrave and other publishers and how they're implementing them to center a westernized approach to research and the operational elements that support it. So I suppose it's especially important for your imprint to look inward at DEI policies and practices given the research you strive to publish. What kinds of internal projects are you implementing to reflect this?
So Palgrave Macmillan's parent company, Springer Nature, has actually dedicated a lot of resources and time to diversity, equity, inclusion in recent years. There's 2 major change accelerating projects underway looking at both internal and external DEI. Because Palgrave Macmillan publishes work on things like race, gender, disability, poverty, and class inequalities, we're really playing a role in helping our parent company connect our community expertise to our plans to change both the way we work and what we create. And I know you asked about internal, but I did want to sort of make the point that internal and external efforts really overlap when you look at publishing companies,
Right.
And when you have in-house acquisition editors. So we're trying to recognise our role as potential gatekeepers for the intellectual canon around these topics and with its connection to things like policy, practice, public thought, and take it very seriously. So a lot of projects have been kicked off. We've implemented some implicit bias training as a sort of early start, as most companies have been, to be honest. But we're also looking at acquisition workshops to inspire and drive a more intentional approach to content strategy on DEI. And we've been contributing to plans to improve the accessibility of our content and developed a wide range of resources, including an inclusive language guide for authors and editors. And we're looking at external editorial recruitment for things like series editors and peer reviewers. And we've contributed to guidelines on how we should or should not publish content that could be deemed as harmful. So we see that we hold a lot of potential to improve representation and amplify marginalised voices, and expanding the diversity of author base and our workforce has to be at the core of this idea. But we do recognise that we've still got a lot of work to do. I'd add that as a manager, it's actually a lot of internal staff who are really driving this change. They want to see us as a publisher of values. But I'm also really proud that the company is investing in paid roles to ensure that this labour doesn't sit with the most underrepresented staff.
Excellent. Just a quick follow. In terms of content acquisition, can you give an example of some of the changes in policy in terms of how your teams are expanding, I guess, their sort of search for and relationships with researchers?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely work in progress, and it does really vary on where you sit in the HSS spectrum of disciplines. There's different needs. There are certain communities that are already kind of so advanced and understand the concepts already that you're sort of already there, but it varies a lot from representation issues, who are we publishing, to how are we publishing, and then what are we publishing? And as I said, I think the HSS bits of the larger organisation are really teaching some of the other subjects on that latter part. But it doesn't just have to be a title about critical race theory. It could also be, we're working with colleagues in things like engineering to teach them on how they can kind of diversify some of their programs as well.
Excellent. So for publishers in general, I mean, where do you typically see the weakest links in representation, not only in the voices that are published, but in the internal workforce as well? Where has it been sort of most important to focus efforts?
So yeah, as I touched on, I don't think the two could be separated. All of publishing, but somehow it feels more urgent in scholarly publishing with the role
Yeah.
it plays in knowledge and understanding, has a representation problem. From entry level roles historically being more easily achieved through social connections or free work experience, which then become a real boundary to most people coming in, to implicit bias driving who gets promoted into decision making roles. We have a lot of work to do. There are different ways to do this. We recently piloted working with a specialist recruitment company to help with a role that we'd created that was specifically looking in sociology and migration, for example. And
Mhm.
honestly, it wasn't as successful as we'd hoped, but it delivered an important lesson where change needs to be focused. So, i.e., earlier in the career chain, probably. In terms of amplifying voices, which is slightly more external, but also internal, I guess there has been a few excellent projects, such as the free content hub that we built as a response to the Black Lives Matter movement. And we did this instead of sending out a non-representative corporate statement. But the change has to be more substantial and longer term than that.
Mhm. Yeah, so we've touched on this a little bit, but as you look at acquiring titles and building your front list, how are you monitoring and or changing your methods to ensure you're decentering a westernized approach to research? How are you, expanding representation among authorship to make sure a diversity of ideas is represented by a diversity of voices?
Sure. I think
Yeah.
so. The first thing I pick up on there is your question, Bill, on measuring. And that
Hmm.
this is a real challenge. And I know we're not the only publisher dealing with this. But the company, again, our parent company, has just invested in some new roles to support how we can ethically capture the data we need to express progress and growth on DEI, and that's ongoing. One huge benefit, actually, of Palgrave Macmillan joining the Spring and Nature family was that we became so much more global, from the supply chain and the colleagues that we work with to where we've been able to base our editors. And this does have an impact on our parallel and more deliberate efforts to globalize our author base. And there's many drivers for needing to do that. But we do need to look at the kind of fullest meaning of diversity and inclusion of representation. So globalness is important, but we have to take an intersectional approach on this. It doesn't just matter where you're based in the world to make sure that we're centering less Western and more Northern voices. And this, so there's a, it's a, I think my answer is this is very complex, but we've
It is.
started.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, going to more specific, it is about doing workshopping, peer-to-peer groups, discussions, some external expertise training, looking at how we're recruiting external editorial stakeholders, looking at which peer reviewers we're using. And yeah, the measuring success here is going to be crucial.
Right. And I guess that ties in. I did want to follow up briefly on the data that you said the company's working on in an ethical manner, just collecting to see or measure progress or where you're at. Are some of those factors you've just mentioned kind of potentially supporting that data that's being collected within the company?
Yeah. And there's, as we know, as social scientists, there are quantitative data and there's qualitative data. And we
Right.
have a lot of the latter. But as we are a business with shareholders, we do need to have quantitative data. And
Hmm.
that's the stuff that's a bit more challenging and not terribly DEI friendly sometimes. But I'm really proud that we've actually put some paid roles behind this. We don't have the answers yet, but we're really working
Hmm.
on it.
That's great. Okay, excellent. So in academia, we've seen COVID-19 cause major burnout, leading to a lower research output and a decrease in peer reviewers and so on, which it can especially impact female and marginalized authors. How do you see publishers supporting scholars in research and publishing? How can they aid communities who particularly experience the effects of scholarly burnout?
Yeah, it's a really good, important question. I mean, I do hope that some of the wider external DEI work we're doing will have a small feedback effect here. But we've absolutely seen this huge amount of pressure on caregivers and marginalized people, and also things like early career academics experiencing loneliness, international scholars becoming alienated from their families. So we haven't actually had a singular reaction. We've needed to stay quite flexible in our responses.
Mm.
Many authors, for example, wanted extensions to their manuscript deadline. Others felt an imperative to make sure their research, particularly if it was related to the pandemic, needed to get out as quickly as possible. And we also had a free content hub again to make sure for a set time that we were widely disseminating any relevant knowledge. And again, this wasn't just the science, it was also the social, behavioural, humanities research. I do think that we have to remember that scholarly publishing is part of an academic ecosystem. Our support needs to fit in and not interrupt the services we offer to authors and libraries. So, for example, with the manuscript delays, we couldn't just stop delivering the promised books indefinitely. So certainly an ongoing issue. It's not over. One final point I would make on this is that I think there can be a bit of a false dichotomy built between research publishing staff and research professionals. So we should just mention that our teams and our people have faced and continue to face very similar challenges. So there's absolutely a lot of empathy. We're in this with you.
Yes, yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you for making that.
You just heard from Tamsine O'Riordan, Editorial Director, Social Science, and Felicity Plester, Editorial Director, Humanities, both from Palgrave Macmillan. This series is brought to you with support from Palgrave Macmillan. Join us next week when we discuss how Palgrave continues to evolve its editorial acquisition strategies, the role peer review plays in expanding the diversity of communities, disciplines, authorship, and ideas, and how community engagement helps Palgrave facilitate its HSS goals.
I think there's a real value in a publisher being understanding and supportive of academics and their needs. At the end of the day, academics do have to publish, and fostering author relationships and becoming an ally to the academic community means that relationship can be much more reciprocal and collaborative, basically. So in addition to the two campaigns that we've just been speaking about, we have an early career researcher hub and a mid-career researcher hub on our website to kind of provide advice and guidance about publishing at these points in one's career. And these have been really, really helpful over the years. And again, we've had some good feedback about them. And the humanities in particular has always struggled to kind of demonstrate impact, for example. So being able to direct authors to some ways in which this might be achieved is exceptionally important.
As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.